I am still working on the cab floor and firewall and grinding away to get it ready for treating and coating with KBS, and there will be an upcoming video on finishing the cab floor restoration. But I can only handle so much grinding at any one time, and so in between sessions working on the cab, I'm working on some of the smaller parts of Trixie's restoration, like the steering column. This is the steering column of my HZ1 tonner Trixie, and I've already started pulling it apart, and I'll continue pulling it apart and clean up the rust and the dust and the wasp nests and the electrical contacts and wiring, and I guess I'll find out if I need to replace bearings or springs or clips or whatever else I'm going to find in here. Then I'll put it back together, and it will likely just sit on the shelf until Trixie is ready to have it reinstalled. Trixie's steering column seems to be completely original. It's obviously dusty and rusty in a lot of places, but it's all there and it works. So this rebuild is mostly a cleanup and a refresh. Now, I found kits for the upper and lower bearings pretty easily at Rare Spares. I'm sure other places have them too. And we already have some Kill Rust, which is a 3-step system, rust converter, primer, and I chose satin black paint, and that'll be just fine for this. The trick, though, I think, is finding the right tool and the right abrasive attachment to remove all the existing paint and rust, but without scoring the metal, especially the lock cylinder housing, which I think is also called a honey pot or coffee pot by some, because it's an alloy and it's quite soft. And I also need a trick to somehow get up inside the steering column tube too, because there's some rust and grit up there. The only part of this that stings a tiny bit is removing this number or code on the firewall plate, because it looks factory and it feels like stripping away some of Trixie's identity, but I'm sure I'll get over it. Rust doesn't have any sympathy for keeping things original. The electrical parts, like contacts, wires and switches, I'm just going to clean them up with contact cleaner. There's no apparent damage to them. They look in excellent condition, and it all worked before I pulled Trixie apart. And this looks like the original key, but it clearly needs replacing. Getting the lock cylinder out, that bit that you put your key into, was tricky. I just could not see any way to release it from the housing or honeypot. I had to do some research, and I only found 2 or 3 little clues on different Holden forums, but that turned out to be enough. And it turns out that no, you can't see how to release the lock cylinder because it's completely hidden by a thin layer of the housing's casting. Well, that thin layer will still be there if you have the original lock cylinder and it's never been removed before, and that is the case with Trixie. You have to scratch through that thin layer of casting to get at a spring latch in the lock cylinder, and you push the spring latch in, and it actually took a few goes to figure out how much to push it in, but when you get it right, the lock cylinder then feels a little bit like it's shifted a little in there, and then you can gently lever it out, and I just used a screwdriver to do that. It's pretty obvious and easy to get the rack assembly and actuator out. They will need a clean and some new grease before going back together, along with the lock cylinder. Same with the lower bearing and retainer. Once the outer piece is unscrewed and removed from the bottom of the steering shaft, the bearing and retainer just slide off with a little bit of gentle persuasion, because there is grime and old grease that's sort of built up on the shaft. Removing the upper bearing took a little bit of time to figure out, and that's really only because of the circlip that holds the bearing and some washers and a spring onto the steering shaft, and I tried every set of circlip pliers that we had, but there was nowhere to grab anything on that circlip to pop it out of its groove. So I just use a pick and levered one end of the circlip out of the groove, then used a punch and a hammer very gently to tap the other end of the circlip around until it could work its way out of the groove too. The locking pliers were there for safety because I really had no idea how much tension that spring was under. But as it turns out, it's not under much tension at all. Then it all just came off with some mild tapping, but the upper bearing stays in the lock cylinder housing, and that's because it's kind of kept in there by more casting, just a thin edge around the edge of the bearing. But I used our hydraulic press to gently push the bearing out, which of course broke that thin edge of casting. Boing. But that's no problem. I've heard that's what happens. And when the new bearing goes in, I might use some JB Weld or some light adhesive just to help it stay put. For getting rust off the steering shaft, I did that mostly with a combination of sandpaper and a power sander. The sander was just too big for my hand though, so I really only managed 10 or 15 seconds at a time, and that got frustrating. But that was really just the start of experiments to work out which tool was going to work best for my little hands. Getting all the rust and paint off the steering column itself, that continued with more experiments. It took a while to find a tool that was a good compromise between a few things. Firstly, being easy for me to control with one hand because I needed to hold the steering column still with my other hand. Secondly, being able to get into the grooves and corners that the tool itself couldn't really flex into. And thirdly, having the right attachment that could cut through the paint and rust quickly enough, but without scratching the metal too much as well. The air tool would have been perfect, but I only got about 20 seconds of run time before the air compressor needed to recharge, and that took twice as long to do that. So the compromise turned out to be a cordless drill with a red Scotch-Brite flap wheel for the outside and a wire kind of cone brush, I guess, on a very, very dodgy makeshift extension for the inside. I just used a strong tape and I taped every join together. Very dodgy, but in the words of Puddin from Puddin's Fab Shop, if it works, is it really a bad idea? In any case, I got all the loose rust off and got enough bare metal exposed on that inside of the column that the kill rust can do the rest of the job. Now, sure, I could have had it all sandblasted, but that easily could have taken a couple of weeks to wait, and I got this done in a few hours, even with the stuffing around to figure out what was going to work. And I did it without spending more money, and I got self-satisfaction as well. Now, as for the lock cylinder housing or honeypot, it's a cast alloy, so I did take it very gently and patiently with the red Scotch-Brite again, and I followed up with some fine sandpaper to get into the crevices, but also just to smooth out the light scratches from the Scotch-Brite. Then I cleaned everything with oil and grease remover, ready for the kill rust treatment, and then reassembly with the new bearings, but that will be in a part 2 to this video. Well, I hope there is at least one little thing that you can take from my experience with this so far, and I hope you join me for the next video too, whatever it is I decide to do next. And for each of you regular viewers, thank you so much for your encouragement and suggestions and stories so far. I always look forward to more of that. And bye for now.